keep from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. That was the Apostle Paul talking about his thorn in the flesh and all of the persecutions and difficulties and trials and tribulations he went through as a believer. That's the thorn that he dealt with, and he pleaded with the Lord to take it away, and the Lord said, No, Paul, I'm not going to take that away, but my grace is sufficient for you. So what do we do whenever the thorns in our lives remain? Well, we do what the Apostle Paul did, and we surrender ourselves to God's grace. And through that grace, God gives us the power to endure the thorns of life. So thank you for joining me for part 2 of my message synopsis, When Thorns Remain. God's grace was poured out into Paul's life in the way of power. And despite the constant pain and burning of that thorn, the persecutions of being a Christian, Paul was able to endure for several reasons. One, because God would ensure that Paul would never be destroyed by that thorn until it was time for him to be called home. And we looked at that in detail last time. And there's a few more ways that God's power was poured out into Paul's life. A second way is that despite the thorn, Paul was able to be content. He said, I have found the secret to being content, whether in plenty or in want, whether hungry or well fed, for through God's grace, that power. He said, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And that literally means through power that is in me, the power that God put in him. And so Paul was able to say, even when he was in prison or being shipwrecked or beaten for the faith, that he was able to be content because that was God's grace being poured out into his life. He was also able to endure in his faith. Through God's power, Paul's faith was able to endure even through all of those hardships. When Paul came to the end of his life and his work was done here on earth, the thorn finally did take his life. But he was able to say this. He was able to say in 2 Timothy 4:7, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, and I have kept the faith. So God's power and grace allowed Paul to endure. His faith was able to stay strong, even in the midst of all of the trials and the tribulations. God's power was also poured out upon Paul through times of refreshing. We see many times that though Paul was going through hard times, God did something really incredible in his life. He sent people into Paul's life to bring him times of refreshing. Now, there were many times that people that Paul thought he could depend on turned their back on him, but God always sent him other people to refresh him, people like Timothy, people like Titus, people like Onesiphorus, who would encourage Paul during his difficulties, and they would give him the encouragement and the strength that he needed. And the fifth way that God's grace was poured out is in Paul's life is by giving Paul the power to turn what was meant for evil into good. And what I mean by this is an incredible fact of Paul's ministry is that he penned at least 5 of his New Testament epistles while he was in prison. So even though the thorn was burning, was infiltrating his flesh while he was enduring those hardships in prison, It gave him the opportunity to write 5 of the New Testament epistles, through which he was able to share the gospel to his readers then and throughout the centuries, right on up to you and I. And so God always takes those things that are evil, and through His grace and His power, He turns them into good. And so, if there are thorns in your life that still remain, know that God's grace is available to you, and through that grace, His power will give you all that you need to endure. Well, thanks for joining me for this brief message synopsis. But if you want more details and an opportunity to discuss these types of issues, join us at New Day Fellowship at 115 North Fayette Street in Shippensburg every Sunday morning at 10:30 for a free breakfast, incredible time of worship and fellowship and discussion on these biblical topics that are so relevant to our everyday lives. So we look forward to seeing you there. And hey, bring a friend. We'd love to have them.